sour, nigga, you can shop with me. 100% sour, nigga, you can shop with me. Gelato with no G, nigga.
Thank you for coming back and joining me on the Highlights podcast. I'm your host, Mike Spivey. Last we left off with a history of cannabis starting from the ancient world. Just to give a recap, we went from Asia as a place of interest where it started, its migration from Central Asia through nomadic communities and the Silk Road, bringing it to the coastal cities of Asia. From the coastal cities, Aryan cultures, European cultures, traders, conquerors brought the plant back to Europe, brought it to India in conquest. We spoke about the Indian culture, and I want to go backwards for a minute because I think when you handle people's culture, you should be responsible on how you do so. And I mentioned cannabis and its psychotropic effects, and at first being really kind of noticed on a large scale when they took the plant to India and it was a warmer climate and a more resinous plant grew. And in that I mentioned that it had an effect on the two religions that came out of India, Buddhism and Hinduism. Now, in Buddhism, the founding father of Buddhism was Gautama Buddha. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. Born Siddhartha Gautama. He was the one who I mentioned left his palace, and for 6 years he meditated and he ate one seed of cannabis, and I mentioned that in mythology, because this may not be the truth, one seed of cannabis a day kept up the nutritional value of his body. Like I said, this is probably more along the lines of mythology, but it does speak to the nutritional value of cannabis in this country and their beliefs about it. This is just a summation of thought on that. But I didn't mention his name, and I felt it was necessary to mention his name because in Hinduism, I didn't go into a lot of it, but one of the deities, Lord Shiva, I mentioned, was the Lord of the Bong, which is another word for cannabis. So, apologetically so, I don't want to say Buddhism or imply by my actions that Buddhism is less than Hinduism. So I felt it important to come back and just mention that name just in case you want to go back and research who that person was. I'm going to take the time to make a correction from the first episode. That episode, I was trying to get everything out there, and I was a little bit anxious, and I misquoted something. I said there were 3 states that had legalization of cannabis. For whatever reason I did it, but I'm here to correct it today. So here's a reference point of all the states that have some legal form of cannabis, and it's 10 of them. So here's a reference point for you. Check that out. I'm going to move on to something else. But I did want to make that correction because I do want to be responsible with the information that I provide to you. So when we're talking about the Indian culture, the one footnote that I did want you to remember is that it did have a profound effect in the Indian culture, not only as a commodity that could be traded for nutritional value or created for textile purposes, but it has some effect on the spiritual nature of the Indian people. And it shows up in their philosophies and dogma, religion, however you want to look at it. We're going to continue to talk about Middle Eastern culture. We're going to continue to talk about European cultures, but we're going to stop off in the Middle East for a while because this is where I, kind of like to throw shit in the game, see what's up, the possibilities, the duality of a situation going down differently. But when you look at the Middle East, it kind of borders Africa, so much so that the cultures kind of merge. When you look at Egyptian people today, they're a combination of Arab and I would, say black, of the native people of that land. But it's been such a process of the cultures blending that the people don't actually look the way that they did historically. But being that they're so close, and Egypt does have a history with the plant cannabis as a textile, as paper on their scrolls, kind of similar to the way it was in the ancient Chinese culture, leads me to believe that they could go just as far back in time with hemp, cannabis, as the Asian cultures. Now, you say, some people are going to argue the point that the land isn't, conducive to growing. It's desert. Much of northern Africa is desert. And that's understood, but Egyptian culture still thrives, so they had to be excellent cultivators as well to be able, they built pyramids. They had to have a workforce to build the pyramids, and they're in this desert-like area. How did they accomplish this? How did they feed all of the people that built the pyramids? So they had to be excellent agriculturalists. But I'm going to differentiate the point right now, in that I feel that the Chinese culture definitely was on top of the botany, because in a sense they can be considered the agriculturalists of the old world. But when you look at the Egyptian culture, they were building, they had spiritual beliefs. They were a fully developed culture that may have not have been as focused on the plant medicinally or for its nutritional value, but they were surely aware of it. And medicinally, the Egyptians were somewhere else with it, because modern day surgery tools look like the same tools that they used in ancient Egyptian times. So that's just food for thought. So as we mentioned, Middle Eastern culture, being close to Egypt, me throwing shit in the game, as far as to, different angles that these things could have occurred. There is something very significant about Middle Eastern culture and cannabis that I want to mention. And the Middle Eastern culture probably got came into contact with the resinous form of the plant, because I would say, according to what I read in the history, on the History Channel's magazine regarding the history of cannabis, it was stated that they used it as an intoxicant. And this is very important, because I would assume at this point in time the only major intoxicant was alcohol. And that's what was not, how can I say, it was a restricted value to their culture as far as religious ideology. Like alcohol being outside of your faculties is not cool with God. So when it was introduced into that world, as devout as those people can be regarding their religion, they acknowledged it as an intoxicant and forbade the use of it, pretty much like alcohol. So at this point, I'm looking at it as being, this is the first time that there's been some type of stigma put on the plant. Not saying that in India that there were groups of people who looked down on the use of cannabis and it being an intoxicant, but it was more prevalent in this culture to say no to cannabis. And that's the footnote that we need to take note of in history, to see that religious ideology has passed judgment on cannabis thousands of years before it even got to the stage where we are now. And that's just the main cooking point for me. You know what I'm saying? Because we're going to come back and address this in religious ideology later. Just to make another footnote, in ancient Asian cultures, they were aware of the psychoactive effects of cannabis, but here we go again in the ancient world, religious ideology, Taoism, not being outside of your faculties and bearing, how can I say, wanting to be intoxicated is not part of the religion. It's not part of the ideology or the dogma. So we'll move on from there in a second. So as I surmise the point, we talked about Arab cultures and we talked about Asian cultures. We talked about religious ideology. We talked about Taoism in a Asian community. And for some reason in my mind, and I'm probably wrong in this, but I'm going to say it anyway, I consider Taoism more of a philosophy than religious ideology or dogma. So that's why I made it a point to make that footnote at that point in time that this was the first time that judgment was probably passed upon cannabis as in a negative light when it came to intoxication. So as we fast forward, we're going to go back to European culture because European culture reflects directly on our belief system about hemp cannabis in this country. So we're going to take a moment to jump into that. So we just spoke about ideology, dogma, religion, philosophy, as it relates to Middle Eastern culture, Muslim culture, and how it relates to Asian culture. The one note that I did want to put into play is that in both societies, they never negated the other uses of the plants. In Asian culture, they created paper that you could write with from hemp. They created garments, clothing. Same thing in the Muslim communities. Some of their fine garments were made from hemp. So there was more of a social demonization on it, but not, because it was used in other ways. To move on from there in thought, just an interesting point regarding the Asian culture and it being used as a commodity. It was also used as a form of currency. This is just one of those off-the-wall things that I noticed that, stuck in my head, that in ancient Asian culture, they were able to pay their taxes with hemp. Very interesting point to me, very interesting point to me. But we're going to move back into the Middle East. And no, we're moving away from the Middle East. We're going to go back into Europe. Because as we can see coming off the Asian continent, the Aryan, the European traders and stuff like that. And this is an interesting group of people because I'm going to bring them up a little bit later and associate them with something else. But as we go through Europe, there's a lot of people that had influences on cannabis. And, it even breaks down to the terms that we use to relate to cannabis today. Russian botanist, D.E. Cheniskowski. I'll throw his name up there for you. He studied and named Cannabis ruderalis. Cannabis indica and Cannabis sativa were also named by European naturalists, herbalists, however you want to put it. I do have their names from the previous episode. We'll throw a flash up there of those people during this episode, but that's not the primary point. There's a lot of things throughout Europe pretty much shaped the way that we thought about cannabis, and they really didn't have a psychoactive form of cannabis, so they really just focused on the industrial properties, the nutritional values, but in that, they also recognize the medicinal values of cannabis or hemp. So as I surmise the European influence, we're going to say this. Cannabis came into Europe from a lot of different angles. You had Russian You have Russian botanists studying it, so that suggested that it came from a route via Siberia. But coming through Siberia, you're kind of neighboring over to China, so he studied it in Siberia as well as central China. So that's another avenue that cannabis could have came into Europe. And it probably is. The whole point of it is it was a saturation of cannabis. And when I say cannabis, I'm referencing hemp because I wouldn't say that in Europe they had psychoactive properties in their cannabis. I think they thought about it more as a commodity and it being a textile and it being and the value of its nutrition. And that's how they utilize the plant. Even when you move forward and you talk about the presence of hemp or cannabis in the ancient world, let's look at the Renaissance. A lot of the art that we value that came out of the Renaissance era was on hemp paper. It's durable paper. In some cases, it's even waterproof, but it stands to the test of time. So Europeans actually used cannabis and used it as a commodity throughout the entire country, but they were less responsive to the psychoactive properties because the temperate nature of Europe may not have produced a plant that had resinous properties to it. So that's it on that. I'm not going to go super deep into it. I'm going to make mention of a few people. The first person in Europe to actually write about cannabis was a Greek historian called Herodotus. Yeah, I might be horribly butchering names right now, but that's beside the point. I'll give a reference in here so you can see how his name is spelled and you can go back. But he mainly documented all of the industrial uses of cannabis and how it was used in Scythian culture, which is Greek culture, but he's looking back into his own history, into the uses of cannabis. So whether it's Scythian in another time period or Greek in another time period, it's the same people and it's the same thing. So we have an understanding that people from the European continent has written about it and they testament to all the different values of cannabis or hemp as it's not a psychoactive drug, so the industrial uses of it. So in discussing European culture and discussing Herodotus being the first person that actually documented cannabis or wrote about cannabis in the European Empire, we're going to move on to other relevant people who were in Europe and actually documented cannabis at various points in time. There's a lot to be said for this and how to put this together. And I'm looking on my computer. I'm trying to put it all together where I can make it concrete. But you had an English naturalist, William Turner, who authored a book called The New Herbal in 1538. In that time period, you also had an Italian botanist, Pietro Andrea Gregorio Mattioli, who wrote in the same era about the herbal effects of cannabis. But we also move a little bit further down the line to an English herbalist called Nicholas Culpeper, who documented it around 1649. Now, this is what's interesting about Culpeper, because the other two guys I just mentioned, they spoke about cannabis from the perspective and its herbal, and I'm assuming healing capabilities and whatnot. But Nicholas Culpeper, an English naturalist, actually created a list of things that medicinally cannabis was able to address. coughing, flatulence, jaundice, colic, gout, joint pain, parasites, and inflammation. All of these things at this point in time, they acknowledge the medicinal value. Now, remember in Europe, the temperate climate, they may not have had resinous forms. So even in its simplest state as hemp, it has a strong medicinal value. This is the first time I'm thinking that we're really making significant notification in human history about cannabis. Now, that's a broad statement because I'm pretty sure in the Asian culture, in their pharmacopoeia, they did study cannabis and they did have information regarding this. But as far as the agricultural and pharmacopoeia, there's still a lot of things that have not been translated and probably won't be translated because of the cultural divide. You know, people not understanding. And this is an important point because the next person I'm going to talk about was a Portuguese doctor. And his name is Garcia de Outra. So, Portuguese doctor Garcia de Outra wrote a book. And I got to look down to read this because I want to deliver this information right. So, I'm looking at my notes. Don't mind me. But Dr. De Outra wrote a book called Colloquies on the Simples and Drugs and Medicinal Matters of India. And this book is actually relevant in the sense of his observations of cannabis. Now, mind you, in Europe, they were only looking at it more so as a commodity, a textile, nutritional value, I guess you would say a food, not really knowing much about the psychotropic effects. So, when De Outra traveled the world and he wrote this book, but he traveled into India, and more specifically, he had comments regarding cannabis. And let's just say when we observe other cultures, we are biased as to what they do and how they respond to things. And if we don't understand it, we have a tendency to mishandle. And this is just human nature, you know, period. Across any race or religion there is, our biases set us against what's actually or what may actually be happening and the understanding thereof. So, De Outra, the Portuguese guy, doctor, he did a lot of documenting, but while he studied in India, he noticed that there was a psychotropic effect to cannabis, that people were using it as an intoxicant. And I won't give his exact quote, but he inferred that the psychotropic responses to cannabis were not relevant to anything. Like they had no value, you know, for the Indian culture, which could be a premise for why in the United States is listed as a Schedule I drug and is considered to have no medicinal value. All of this is a talking point. It's crazy because part about what we talk about in this country in present day is cannabis not having medicinal value, whereas we're seeing from ancient times to current that there is medicinal value. So who's bullshitting who in this situation? Yeah, there's something deeper going on here. You know what I mean? And what it is, I don't know, but hopefully we'll explore it and find out. So as we talk about the European culture and how it affects cannabis, we're going to talk about somebody or an entity, and this is going to be real interesting, that kind of threw shade on cannabis, period, but more so as a psychotropic effect. Now, as I was looking through the magazine and the History Channel regarding cannabis and its history, I was looking for specific things, and one thing that's prevalent today, there's a lot of misinformation regarding cannabis. And I think I might have found a starting point. And I can't say it may have been a person, but it was a person that was part of an organization. And that organization was called the East Indian Company. Now, this is a European company that was based on trading. When I went to go look up and try to figure out who this doctor might have been, I realized that it was an entity, so it was a doctor that worked for an entity. And he came to a conclusion based on observation. Now, remember, I just previously said we, as people, human beings, things we don't understand, we have a tendency to mishandle it. So this doctor from this organization, and I'm going to tell you more about the organization and who I believe they actually are, but the doctor made a statement that opiates were derivative of the belladonna nightshade plant and bong, the Indian word for cannabis or weed or marijuana, however you want to look at it, hemp. This in itself was damaging to cannabis in the sense that cannabis is not an opiate, but is of a sedative nature, as most opiates are. I would venture to say that cannabis is a mild sedative because for you to get the compounded effects and have a really heavy sedative, you have to use cannabis in a different form, so it has to be processed. And making this assertion that these two ingredients, made up the opiates that were, the deadly intoxicants, because you could have OD'd off opium back then just like you can now. But the difference between cannabis and opiates is cannabis has a zero threshold for death. In other words, no matter how much cannabis you use, it's not going to kill you. This regarding cannabis in Europe is we see that it's been misrepresented, which could have led to the demonization of it as far as it being part of the cocktail that makes up opium. But another point of interest in understanding who people are throughout time, the East Indian Company was a European company that was set up for the exploitative trade of, moving around, traveling. India happened to be one of the places that was conquered and European influence was asserted, and cannabis actually got there from China, supposedly. So we're rolling with that as part of the common history. But another substantial historical point is that those same people transitioned, being traders, having wealth, bringing commodities to and fro places. I believe that those Aryan traders actually were the Europeans that formed the East India Company, the same company that's kind of responsible for the demonization of cannabis based on its intoxicating nature and a comparison or being made as an ingredient of opium through misunderstanding. When we look at all of this East Indian Company, I can't say anything bad about it because they did what they did in that world. But I did see a reference while I was Googling them that they were drug traffickers as well. So despite all of the commodities that hemp could be used for, we also see that, there were people who built wealth off of trade, hemp being part of that trade, being an essential part of that trade, it influencing the culture as far as hemp paper being brought through Spain into Europe from Arab conquerors, them recording art and history to hemp paper and its durability. The European continent has a large influence over American societal views on cannabis as they progress through today. And on that note, I'm racking my brains because there's a lot more that I do want to say and I want to deliver to you. But I got to take this in small bits and pieces because to give you information that's accurate to the point where you can come to your own summations or do your own research, it's a little more difficult than possible. I mean, a little more difficult than it is easy because I feel a sense of social responsibility to my peoples, to the people that I'm trying to ingratiate with knowledge about cannabis. But we're going to take this segment and we're going to roll out. I want to thank you for your time. You're chilling with Mike Spivey on the Highlights Podcast. One love and peace.
Yeah.